Picture this scene, if you will. It's 40,000 years before Christ, and the world is a place so alien to our modern sensibilities that we can barely wrap our minds around it. We're talking about a planet locked in the grip of an ice age so brutal, so unforgiving, that simply surviving another day was an achievement worthy of celebration. The Vézère Valley in what we now call France was home to scattered bands of early humans who lived lives that were, to borrow from Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, imagine you're a young man named Grok. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Grok sounds like something out of a Saturday morning cartoon. But bear with me here, because this particular Grok is about to change the course of human history in ways that would make Silicon Valley entrepreneurs weep with envy. Unlike his fellow tribe members, Grok possessed that most dangerous of human traits, curiosity. While others followed the tried and true paths their fathers had walked, Grok had this annoying habit of asking what if. On this particular winter evening, as temperatures plummeted to levels that would make a modern freezer seem tropical, Grok found himself at the very edge of his tribe's territory. Most sensible humans would be huddled together in their caves, sharing body heat and praying to whatever gods they believed in for the sun to return. But not our Grok. He was out there in the bitter cold, alone, when the sky itself seemed to crack open. The lightning strike that hit that ancient oak tree wasn't just any ordinary bolt from the blue. We're talking about nature unleashing the equivalent of several million volts of pure electrical energy in a display that would have sent every other human within a 10-mile radius running for the deepest, darkest cave they could find. Thunder shook the very ground beneath Grok's feet. The flash of light turned night into day for one terrifying instant. But here's where our story takes a turn that separates humans from every other species that has ever walked this planet. While his tribal companions scattered like leaves in a hurricane, Grok stayed put. He watched. He observed. He studied what was happening with the kind of scientific curiosity that wouldn't be formally recognized for another 39,900 years. What Grok witnessed in those crucial moments was nothing short of magical to his primitive understanding. The lightning had done something impossible. It had created a miniature sun right there on the ground. The flames danced and writhed like living creatures, consuming the dry wood with a hunger that seemed almost alive. But more than that, these flames radiated something precious beyond measure in that frozen landscape. Heat. For 3 full days, and when I say 3 days, I mean 72 hours of careful, methodical observation that would make modern scientists proud. Grok studied that burning tree. He noticed how the flames loved dry grass, devouring it with enthusiasm, but died when touched by morning dew. He saw that certain types of wood caught fire easily, while others resisted the flame's advance. He learned that wind could be fire's best friend or its deadliest enemy. Think about the intellectual leap happening here. This isn't just pattern recognition. Any animal can learn that hot things hurt. This is systematic experimentation, hypothesis testing, and knowledge accumulation all rolled into one. Grok was essentially conducting humanity's first scientific study, and his laboratory was a burning tree in the middle of an ice age. When Grok finally worked up the courage to approach the dying flames, his heart must have been pounding like a drum. Everything in his evolutionary programming screamed at him to run. Fire was the enemy, the destroyer of forests, the thing that sent animals fleeing in terror. But Grok saw something else entirely. He saw opportunity. The moment he grasped that burning branch and carried it back to his cave represents one of the most significant technological advances in human history. We're talking about a discovery that ranks right up there with agriculture, the wheel, and the internet in terms of its impact on human civilization. Except this happened 40,000 years ago, when the most advanced technology was a sharpened stick. When Grok arrived at his cave with that flaming branch, his mate Asha's reaction tells us everything we need to know about how revolutionary this moment was. She wept with joy. Not surprise, not fear. Joy. Because for the first time in her life, she felt genuine warmth fill their freezing shelter. The cave that had been a cold, dark refuge from the hostile world outside was suddenly transformed into something approaching comfort. But here's where things get really interesting from a historical perspective. Word of Grok's achievement spread through the valley with the speed of, well, wildfire. And this wasn't just idle gossip around the communal gathering spot. This was intelligence of the highest strategic value, because whoever controlled fire suddenly held the power of life and death over their neighbors. Within a single lunar cycle, that's about 30 days for those keeping track, rival clans were organizing military expeditions to seize this game-changing technology. Leading the charge was a fierce warrior named Thak, a man whose reputation for brutality was legendary even by Ice Age standards. Thak understood immediately that fire wasn't just about staying warm, it was about power, pure and simple. The battle that erupted around Grok's cave that fateful night represents the first recorded instance of warfare driven by technological advantage. Thak's warriors came expecting to overwhelm a single family through sheer numbers and superior weapons. What they found instead was something they had never encountered before: fire as a weapon of war. Grok had spent his month of fire, mastery learning, not just how to keep flames alive, but how to weaponize them. He hardened the tips of wooden spears in his fire, creating weapons that could punch through hide armor, like it was made of paper. He built barriers of burning brush that channeled attacking forces into killing zones. He essentially invented both metallurgy and military engineering in one stroke. When dawn broke over the Vézère Valley, the sight that greeted the survivors must have seemed like a glimpse into a different world entirely. Thak himself, this legendary warrior who had never backed down from any challenge, knelt before Grok in submission. The terms of surrender were telling: the finest flint tools and warmest furs in exchange for a single burning ember. But perhaps the most profound moment in this entire drama came when Grok looked down at his son, little Tam, playing near the fire that had changed everything. This child would grow up in a world fundamentally different from the one his and father had known. For Tam, darkness would never again mean certain death. Stories could stretch deep into the night, doubling the length of the human day. The very rhythm of human existence had been altered forever, and as Grok watched his son reach tiny hands toward the dancing flames, he couldn't possibly have imagined that this simple act of taming fire would lead, in an unbroken chain of cause and effect, to electric lights, combustion engines, and rockets that would one day touch the stars themselves. But all of that was still to come. For now, in that moment of triumph, Grok had achieved something far more immediate and precious. He had given humanity its first real victory over the hostile forces of nature. The age of fire had begun, and with it, our species had taken its first step toward mastering the world around us. The question that hangs in the smoky air of that ancient cave is this: what happens when such a revolutionary discovery begins to spread beyond a single family, a single tribe, a single valley? What forces does it unleash? What new dangers does it create? Because fire, as Grok's descendants would soon discover, was a gift that came with a price, one that would reshape not just human civilization, but the very face of the planet itself. By 35,000 years before Christ, something extraordinary had happened across the vast expanse of Europe. What began as one man's curious observation of a lightning-struck tree had evolved into something far more profound: a hereditary class of firemasters whose influence stretched from the wind-swept Russian steppes to the chalk cliffs of what we now call Britain. Grok's descendants had become the Flame Keepers, and let me tell you, this wasn't just some honorary title passed down through family stories. These people had transformed fire mastery into a science so sophisticated that it would make modern pyrotechnicians take notes. We're talking about 5,000 years of accumulated knowledge, passed down through an unbroken chain of grandmothers and granddaughters, each generation building upon the discoveries of the last. Picture, if you will, an elderly woman named Mara, sitting in a cave somewhere in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Her weathered hands, scarred by decades of working with flame, guide her granddaughter's fingers as they learn to shape pine resin into portable fire carriers. This isn't casual instruction. This is the transmission of knowledge that quite literally means the difference between life and death for entire communities. Mara whispers the sacred formulas, passed down through countless generations, that explain how bear fat mixed with dried moss creates torches capable of burning through the most howling storms. She demonstrates the precise arrangement of certain stones that can hold heat through the longest winter nights, turning a simple cave into a warm sanctuary. Most importantly, she teaches the subtle art of reading fire's moods, how to know when flames are hungry for fuel, when they're struggling against dampness, when they're ready to leap to new material. This knowledge wasn't written down, of course. Writing wouldn't be invented for another 30,000 years. Instead, it lived in the memories and skilled hands of the flamekeepers, encoded in songs and rituals that ensured nothing would be forgotten. When Grandmother Mara sang the fire songs to her granddaughter, she was performing an act of preservation more reliable than any library. But the real test of fire mastery came when two different branches of humanity encountered each other in the dense forests of what we now call Germany. On one side, you had the Neanderthals, our evolutionary cousins, who were physically stronger, better adapted to cold, and had been surviving in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. On the other side, you had the newly arrived Homo sapiens groups, physically smaller but carrying something the sapo. Neanderthals had never fully mastered sophisticated fire technology. The meeting at Rockshelter Feldhofer became the stuff of legend, though not for the reasons you might expect. The Neanderthal leader, a massive man named Kronk, whose strength was legendary even among his own people, faced off against Jorak, the chief of a sapiens clan. But this wasn't a battle decided by muscle mass or weapon quality. This was a confrontation between two different relationships with fire itself. Kronk's people struggled to maintain flames in their damp cave environments. They could start fires, certainly, but keeping them alive through wet seasons or long migrations was a constant battle. When storms raged for days on end, Neanderthal communities often found themselves cold and dark, waiting for conditions to improve enough to restart their fires. Jorak's people, on the other hand, carried fire with them like a pet that never needed feeding. They had discovered that certain types of fungus, when properly prepared and packed into hollow gourds, could smoulder for weeks without bursting into flame. These portable fire carriers meant that sapiens groups were never more than a few minutes away from a roaring blaze, regardless of weather conditions. The negotiation that followed tells us everything we need to know about how valuable fire mastery had become. Kronk, this powerful warrior who had never backed down from any physical challenge, offered his own daughter in marriage to Jorak in exchange for the secrets of portable fire. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a man trading his child for technology. That's how desperately the Neanderthals needed what the sapiens possessed. But here's the tragic irony of the situation. Even intermarriage couldn't save Kronk's people from the creeping cold of changing climate. The Neanderthals, for all their physical advantages, lacked the cultural mechanisms that allowed fire knowledge to spread and evolve rapidly. When the weather turned particularly harsh, entire Neanderthal communities simply vanished, unable to maintain the flames that might have kept them alive. As firekeeping became more precious, new traditions emerged specifically to protect this vital knowledge. The most famous of these was the eternal flame of the Don River people, a fire that burned continuously for over 1,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. 1,000 years of uninterrupted flame, tended day and night by virgin priestesses who devoted their entire lives to keeping humanity's most precious resource alive. These priestesses sang the flame songs that had been passed down through generations, melodies that supposedly contained the secret rhythms needed to keep embers from dying. They maintained precise feeding schedules, adding specific types of wood at carefully timed intervals. They slept in shifts, ensuring that human eyes were always watching the sacred flames. The pressure on these women must have been unimaginable. They weren't just maintaining a fire, they were preserving the lifeline of their entire civilization. Which makes the tragedy of young priestess Vera all the more heartbreaking. Vera was barely 16 years old when fate placed her on night duty during one of the worst blizzards in living memory. The wind howled through the sacred cave with such force that it scattered embers and extinguished flames faster than she could restore them. Despite her desperate efforts, despite following every ritual and procedure she had been taught, the impossible happened. the eternal flame died. For 3 months, 90 days and nights of bone-numbing cold, Vera's entire clan lived in darkness. Children died from the cold. The elderly succumbed to illnesses that warmth might have prevented. The community that had once been prosperous and confident was reduced to huddling together like animals, waiting for salvation that might never come. When traders finally arrived carrying new flame, the relief was so overwhelming that grown men wept openly. But the damage had been done. Vera's name became synonymous with failure, a curse word that parents used to frighten children into being careful around fire. For generations afterward, mothers would warn their daughters, "Don't be a Vera," meaning don't let carelessness destroy everything your people depend upon. The story of Vera serves as a perfect metaphor for humanity's relationship with fire during this period. We had learned to harness this incredible force, but we were still at its mercy in ways that our modern minds can barely comprehend. Fire was friend and master, servant and tyrant, salvation and potential doom all rolled into one flickering, dancing, eternally hungry phenomenon. But even as communities like Vera's struggled with the responsibilities of firekeeping, other groups were pushing the boundaries of what flames could accomplish. Artists were learning to mix charcoal with animal fat to create the first paints. Hunters were discovering that controlled burns could reshape entire landscapes. Warriors were developing fire-based weapons that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. The stage was being set for fire to evolve from a survival tool into something far more profound, the foundation upon which all human civilization would be built. But first, humanity would need to survive the growing pains of learning to live with this double-edged gift from the gods. And in caves across Europe, Asia, and Africa, the Flamekeepers continued their sacred work, preserving and expanding the knowledge that would one day light the entire world. The period from 25,000 to 10,000 years before Christ represents what we might call the Renaissance of fire mastery, a time when humanity took this fundamental discovery and stretched it in directions that would have left our ancestor Grok absolutely speechless. This wasn't just about staying warm anymore. This was about fire becoming the cornerstone of human creativity, spirituality, and civilization itself. Deep in the cave complex at Lascaux, in what we now call France, a master artist named Auroch the Painter was conducting experiments that would revolutionize human expression forever. Auroch had discovered something remarkable. When you mixed charcoal from burned wood with animal fat, you created a substance that could transfer images onto stone walls. But more than that, and here's where it gets truly fascinating, these images came alive when viewed by flickering torch flame. Picture yourself standing in that cave 15,000 years ago, watching Auroch work. The artist's hands move with practiced precision, applying his charcoal and fat mixture to the rough limestone walls. In ordinary daylight, these might look like simple drawings, but when torch flames dance across the surface, something magical happens. The horses seem to gallop. The bison appear to charge. The entire wall becomes a living, breathing tableau of the world outside. The painting ceremonies that grew up around Auroch's innovations became grand social events that drew hundreds of people from across the region. These weren't just art appreciation gatherings, they were religious experiences, community bonding rituals, and technological demonstrations all rolled into one. Families would travel for weeks to witness these flame-lit galleries, where the boundary between art and reality seemed to dissolve entirely. But perhaps the most spectacular demonstration of fire's transformative power came at the Great Gathering at Dolny-Vestonis, 15,000 years before Christ. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a full-scale international convention where over 100 different clans converged to share knowledge, trade goods, and participate in ceremonies that would be remembered for millennia. Each clan arrived carrying their sacred flames, flames that had been kept alive for generations, and represented the accumulated fire wisdom of entire peoples. The ceremonial bonfire they created together burned for a complete lunar cycle, 30 days and nights of continuous flame that could be seen from dozens of miles away. The light from that fire was so intense that it created its own weather patterns, generating winds and thermal currents that affected the entire region. But here's what makes this gathering truly revolutionary from a technological standpoint. It was at Dolní Věstonice that humans first discovered they could use fire to transform the very earth beneath their feet. A master craftsman, whose name has been lost to history but whose work survived, learned that certain clays, when subjected to intense heat, underwent a fundamental change in their molecular structure. Soft, malleable earth became hard, permanent ceramic. The implications of this discovery cannot be overstated. For the first time in human history, people could create objects that were essentially eternal. The voluptuous goddess figurines that emerged from those experimental kilns weren't just art. They were proof that humans had learned to harness fire's power to permanently alter matter itself. We're talking about the birth of material science, happening in a cave in Czechoslovakia 25,000 years ago. Meanwhile, across the vast plains of Central Europe, another firemaster named Chief Borak the Builder was conducting experiments on an even grander scale. Borak had noticed something interesting about the aftermath of natural wildfires. The cleared areas attracted deer, aurochs, and other large game animals who came to feed on the new grass that sprouted from ash-enriched soil. What Borak did next represents one of the earliest examples of large-scale environmental engineering. He began conducting controlled burns across thousands of square miles, carefully managing the spread of flames to create a patchwork landscape of meadows and woodlands. This wasn't random destruction. This was sophisticated ecosystem management that increased the carrying capacity of the land by enormous factors. The results were staggering. Areas that had previously supported perhaps 1 human per 10 square miles suddenly could sustain 10 humans per square mile. Borak had essentially invented agriculture without seeds, using fire to farm the landscape itself. The deer and aurochs populations exploded in these managed environments, providing abundant protein for human communities. The new meadows also supported diverse plant communities that offered everything from medicinal herbs to edible nuts and berries. But with great power comes great responsibility, and fire's capacity for creation was matched only by its potential for destruction. The tragedy that befell young Lyra and her family serves as a sobering reminder that fire remained a force that demanded constant respect and careful handling. Lyra was perhaps 8 years old, playing near her family's summer camp while the adults worked on preparing hides for the coming winter. Like many children throughout history, she was fascinated by the dancing flames of the cooking fire. When no one was watching, she began experimenting with small twigs and dried grass, delighting in how quickly the flames spread to new material. What happened next unfolded with the terrifying speed that only wildfire can achieve. A gust of wind caught Lyra's small experimental fire and carried burning embers into the dry grass surrounding the camp. Within minutes, what had been a small child's innocent play had become a raging inferno that swept across the landscape with unstoppable fury. The Great Black Scar, as it came to be known, destroyed 3 separate settlements and rendered vast areas uninhabitable for decades afterward. Entire families perished in the flames. Generations of accumulated goods, tools, and shelter were reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The smoke cloud was so massive that it was visible from hundreds of miles away, a dark reminder of fire's capacity for devastation. But from tragedy came wisdom. The aftermath of Lyra's fire led to the development of humanity's first formal fire laws, regulations carved into mammoth tusks and enforced by clan leaders who understood that fire served only those who respected its power. These laws established principles that still govern fire safety today: designated fire areas, mandatory supervision of flames, community responsibility for fire containment, and severe penalties for careless behavior. The mammoth tusk tablets that recorded these laws represent some of humanity's earliest attempts at formal governance. They established the concept that some behaviors were so dangerous to the community that they required collective regulation. They created enforcement mechanisms and punishment systems. Most importantly, they codified the understanding that individual actions could have consequences for entire populations. These fire laws weren't just practical regulations. They were moral and philosophical statements about humanity's relationship with forces beyond our complete control. They acknowledged that humans had gained tremendous power through fire mastery, but that this power came with equally tremendous responsibilities. The laws essentially declared that fire was too important to be left to individual judgment alone. The enforcement of these laws created new social roles and hierarchies. Fire wardens were appointed to monitor compliance and investigate accidents. Fire courts were established to adjudicate disputes and assign blame when things went wrong. Punishment systems were developed that could range from temporary banishment to permanent exile, depending on the severity of the fire-related offense. As the Ice Age drew toward its close, the Hearth Masters had achieved something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. They had taken a natural force that had previously been beyond any creature's control and made it into a tool, a weapon, an art medium, a manufacturing process, and a spiritual focus all at once. Fire had become the thread that connected every aspect of human existence. But even as they celebrated these achievements, the wisest among the Hearth Masters understood that they stood at the threshold of even greater changes. The ice was retreating, the climate was warming. The world their ancestors had known for tens of thousands of years was transforming into something entirely new, and with that transformation would come challenges that would test every lesson they had learned about living with fire. The nomadic life that had served humanity so well during the Ice Age was about to give way to something revolutionary: permanent settlement, and fire would be at the very heart of this next great leap forward in human civilization. As the great ice sheets retreated around 12,000 years before Christ, the nomadic flame keepers faced their greatest challenge yet: not extinction, but success. The world was warming rapidly, transforming from the harsh but predictable Ice Age environment their ancestors had mastered into something entirely new: a planet ripe for permanent human settlement. In the fertile crescents of what we now call Turkey, at the remarkable site of Göbekli Tepe, an ancient flamekeeper named Sorin found himself witnessing the end of an era. Sorin was old even by the standards of his long-lived lineage, his memory reaching back through oral traditions that spanned centuries. He had devoted his entire life to preserving the sacred knowledge of fire mastery that stretched back to Grok himself, 40,000 years in the past. But now Sorin watched his granddaughter Anya use fire in ways that would have seemed impossible to those ancient ancestors. Instead of simply maintaining flames for warmth and protection, Anya was using controlled burns to clear vast areas of land for the strange new practice of deliberately planting seeds. She was using fire not just to cook wild game, but to process cultivated grains into bread. The very relationship between humans and the natural world was being revolutionized, and fire was the engine driving that change. Sorin understood that he was witnessing a transition as significant as Grok's original taming of flame. The nomadic life that had sustained humanity through the Ice Age was giving way to agricultural settlements. People were no longer following the herds and the seasons. They were staying in one place, year after year, generation after generation. And with that change came new demands on fire mastery. Permanent settlement required permanent fires, hearths that could burn continuously for decades without the risk of spreading to surrounding structures. It required new technologies for storing and preserving food using controlled heat and smoke. Most importantly, it required new ways of thinking about fire's role in human society. Sorin's solution was as ingenious as it was enduring. He began encoding the ancient fire wisdom into the very architecture of the first temples, creating spaces where the sacred knowledge would be preserved in stone and ritual for future generations. The circular hearths at the center of these temples weren't just functional features. They were libraries, universities, and museums all rolled into one. Each stone arrangement contained specific information about fire management. The positioning of the hearth relative to ventilation openings taught lessons about airflow and combustion. The types of stones used demonstrated principles of heat retention and distribution. The ceremonial procedures that grew up around these hearths ensured that critical knowledge would be passed down through religious ritual, even if the practical applications changed over time. But not everyone welcomed the transition from nomadic to agricultural life. The changes threatened the power and status of traditional nomadic clans, who had built their entire identity around mobility and fire mastery in portable forms. When agricultural communities began claiming exclusive rights to fire sources, controlling access to forests for fuel, quarries for firestones, and peat bogs for slow-burning materials, conflict became inevitable. The warrior woman Katya emerged as the leader of a confederation of nomadic clans who refused to accept the new agricultural order. Katya wasn't just fighting for territory or resources. She was fighting for a way of life that had sustained humanity through 40 millennia of Ice Age challenges. Her forces represented the last great stand of the traditional flame keepers against the settled world that was rapidly replacing them. The fire wars that erupted across Anatolia were unlike any conflicts in human history up to that point. These weren't raids or territorial disputes between similar groups. These were civilizational clashes between two fundamentally different ways of organizing human society. The nomads fought with the mobility and fire mastery that had made them dominant for countless generations. The agricultural communities fought with the numbers and resources that permanent settlement made possible. The battles themselves were spectacular affairs that combined traditional warfare with sophisticated fire-based tactics. Katya's forces used portable fire weapons, flaming arrows, fire-hardened spears, and mobile braziers that could be deployed rapidly across changing battlefields. The agricultural defenders relied on fixed fire installations, permanently positioned hearths that could heat defensive stones to glowing temperatures, fire trenches that created impassable barriers, and coordinated smoke signals that allowed rapid communication across vast defensive networks. But perhaps more than any military advantage, what ultimately ended the fire wars was diplomacy. The Treaty of the Seven Flames, negotiated by representatives from both sides, established a principle that would echo through human history. Fire knowledge was declared the birthright of all humans, never to be hoarded by one group or used as a weapon of exclusion. The treaty created 7 permanent ceremonial fires, each maintained jointly by nomadic and agricultural communities, where fire wisdom would be shared freely. Representatives from both sides would meet at these sites annually to exchange knowledge, settle disputes, and ensure that no community would ever again be denied access to fire mastery based on their way of life. This wasn't just a peace treaty. It was humanity's first international agreement about technology sharing. It established precedents for cooperation that would influence human society for millennia to come. Most importantly, it ensured that the accumulated fire wisdom of 40,000 years would survive the transition from nomadic to agricultural civilization. By 10,000 years before Christ, Grok's simple discovery had cascaded into technologies that would have seemed like pure magic to that curious caveman. His great-great-grandson, countless generations removed, a master craftsman named Doran, discovered that certain green stones, what we now know as copper ore, would weep metal tears when heated in the hottest flames. Doran's discovery of metallurgy represents one of the most profound technological leaps in human history. For the first time, people could extract pure elements from raw earth and shape them into tools that were harder, sharper, and more durable than anything nature provided. The copper tools that emerged from Doran's experimental forges were so superior to stone implements that they triggered another revolution in human capability. Simultaneously, a potter woman named Mira was pushing the boundaries of ceramic technology. She discovered that different clays, fired at precisely controlled temperatures, could create vessels with radically different properties. Some clays produced waterproof containers that could hold liquids indefinitely. Others created porous vessels, perfect for storing grain through seasonal changes. Still others yielded ceramics so fine and smooth that they could be used for the most delicate food preparation. Mira's innovations weren't just about making better pots. They were about understanding and controlling the fundamental properties of matter itself. Her kilns became laboratories where the basic principles of chemistry were explored through trial and error, generation by generation. The knowledge she accumulated about material properties would eventually lead to advanced metallurgy, glassmaking, and ultimately to the industrial processes that power our modern world. each innovation built upon the last in an unbroken chain of cause and effect that stretched back to Grok's first tamed flame. The portable fire carriers developed by the ancient flamekeepers led to controlled burns for landscape management. Landscape management led to agricultural settlement. Agricultural settlement led to permanent hearths and specialized fire technologies. Specialized fire technologies led to ceramics and metallurgy. Ceramics and metallurgy led to complex tools and weapons. Complex tools and weapons led to advanced civilizations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire progression is how it demonstrates the compound effect of human knowledge. Each generation didn't start from scratch. They built upon everything their ancestors had learned. Fire wisdom accumulated like interest in a bank account, growing exponentially as it was passed down through time. Today, every electric light that illuminates our cities carries within it the genetic code of Grok's first flame. Every combustion engine that powers our vehicles operates on principles that the ancient flamekeepers would recognize, even if they would be astounded by the applications. Every rocket that launches into space is essentially a controlled explosion, harnessing the same fundamental forces that Grok learned to manage with burning branches and dry grass. The space shuttle launching from Cape Canaveral and the primitive torch carried by a Cro-Magnon hunter are connected by an unbroken chain of human innovation. Both represent humanity's determination to harness natural forces for our own purposes. Both demonstrate our species' unique ability to turn observation into understanding, understanding into technology, and technology into power over our environment. When you flip a light switch in your modern home, you're participating in a ritual that began 40,000 years ago in a cave in France. When you start your car engine, you're invoking the same principles that allowed ancient humans to transform raw materials into tools. When you watch a rocket disappear into the night sky, you're witnessing the latest chapter in a story that began when one curious caveman decided to study a lightning-struck tree instead of running away in terror. This is the eternal legacy of the first flame, proof that human curiosity, carefully nurtured and passed down through generations, can echo through tens of thousands of years and literally reach for the stars. Grok couldn't have imagined that his simple act of fire taming would one day lead to humans walking on the moon. But every step of that incredible journey was built upon the foundation he laid. And somewhere in the quantum mechanics that govern the fusion reactions powering our sun, in the electromagnetic forces that allow us to generate electricity, in the chemical processes that make rockets burn, the ghost of that first tamed flame continues to dance. It reminds us that the difference between a shivering animal and a spacefaring civilization can sometimes be traced back to one person's willingness to ask, "What if?" instead of simply accepting the world as it appears to be. The fire that began with Grok burns on, in forms he never could have imagined, carrying humanity ever forward into an unknown but illuminated future.